Well, greetings, everyone. Good to see you again. Hope you enjoy this lesson that I'm about to speak to you about. And it's something I'm really excited about because it had a lot of memories to me about my military career. The title of this talk and discussion is called God's Training School to Win Our Battles. You know, all my military career, as I progressed throughout my time there, I've been training one time or another. In fact, during the whole time I've spent, my 34 years actually, there wasn't a time that I was not training and trying to attain more knowledge and more understanding of what my responsibilities were, what I need to know for my knowledge, and never stopped. The more I attained, the more they expected of me to know. And so they sent me to numerous training schools, and I was expected to try to achieve and to find new knowledge and new capabilities so I could have greater responsibilities. And I could advance my thinking, and then my confidence would greater. And then I would have better decision making. And then I was a better resource for the Army of talent and expectations and that challenges are given me. So it was a whole career of nonstop trying to learn new things and new ways of doing what I need to do. And the Army wanted me to do that. Well, training was really a key to success in everything that I did. And I found out that training, no matter what type of work you do or what line of work you are in or have done, and throughout our whole lives, training is a very cornerstone of our success. It's always a time in which we're always looking to understand something better, to grow in knowledge of how to do something, and advance our perspective in a more wider lens, I guess you might say, to look at the world and to understand it a little better. And what really surprised me is that the more that I trained, the more that I enjoyed it. Oh, it was hard. You better believe it was hard. And the risk of failure was there. But the challenge of it, and then the things they showed me, and the new exciting things that I learned was just really wonderful. And I really look forward to every training they wanted me to go to or they asked me to complete. Sometimes I was drug into it a little bit because I thought I was kind of too busy for that kind of stuff. But once I got into it, I really, really enjoyed it. And I wanted to get that knowledge and understanding and wanted to succeed in what I was doing. With the knowledge added to experiences, I attained the wisdom then, but I never was completed because I'm always learning no matter what. Even to this day, even though I have left the military, I to this day am still learning. I'm still seeking out knowledge to understand things better in the changing world that is so fast and new ways of doing things. Now, more importantly, though, my spiritual life in seeking ways to serve God and how to serve God. You know, doing the same old ways, the same old things, the same old ways will get you the same results unless you learn something different, new aspects of things, because things do change. I may not. So in that case, I need to change and to learn how to adapt to new challenges. My age and my experiences are the very platform that I have, is that I keep on striving to learn more and more. Well, let me share with you an experience that I had early in my military career that really changed my perspective on training and kind of underlines what I'm talking about training. It was a very hot August day in Georgia that I remember so well. I remember putting on a heavy parachute and slowly walking, or you might say waddling, because it was so heavy and it was so tight around me, out to the plane that was sitting down. Inside of it, I sat down in a fiber and nylon cloth seat, put on my safety belt, and waited for the plane to take off. And I was on my way to do my first parachute jump out of an airplane. I mean, the words and the thoughts came to me like crazy as I was waiting to go to that time to exit that aircraft. I can't believe I'm doing this. Will I break a leg? Will I freeze at the door and I'll just chicken out, and embarrass myself? And my heart was racing. And I played over and over again the training that was given to me over those weeks before that parachute jump of exactly what to do in every circumstance that I might encounter at that time. I mean, what happens if my parachute doesn't open up? What do I do? Well, they trained us on what to do. But all those questions and all those doubts and fears came at me, but the test was there in front of me as we flew up into the air. Well, I heard the jump commands to stand up and clip on my static line and head to the door. The moment of truth was there. No more training, and the preparation was done. The door loomed in front of me, and I stood looking out to the horizon and the small trees that flew by below me. Over a loud engine noise and the wind noise, I heard the command, "Go." Well, I'm writing this and talking to you about it, and so obviously I made the jump safely. But that moment will forever live in my memory with all my emotions. It made a dramatic change in my life that I could achieve something so great, so hard, through really arduous training, that I listened carefully to the instructions. I did exactly what they told me. And I took the test. I went up there and I used all those training times that they showed me, and I was successful, and my emotions did not take me away from what I had to do. Well, the ground came up to me as I floated down. It came up so fast. And by instinct, through my training, I put my feet and knees together, and I hit the ground and rolled. And I stood up, both legs not broken. I stood up and done, and I just yelled out in accomplishment of excitement that I finally did it. I did it. After all that time, I was tested and I did it. Tomorrow, it will be another test. I'll be ready to do it again because I did it this time. Every Christian is enrolled in a school. I don't care how old you are. I don't care who you are. If you are a Christian, you are enrolled in a school, and it's called God's training school. You may not be learning on how to parachute out of an airplane, but it is critical to being a successful Christian, a child of God, and learning how to serve God more fully and more from a heart and a spiritual soul of giving and love. Hebrews 12:8 says this to us: if you are without training or discipline, another way of saying it, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. So we're saying here is that every true child of God is enrolled in the program, whether you like it or not. It's automatic. There is some good news and bad news in this, though, about God's training school. The good news is nobody fails the course. It says in Philippians, I am confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perfect it unto the day of Christ Jesus. So if God has begun a work in you, he will see you through that trial. He will see you through that test and that training. Now, the bad news. The bad news is you don't graduate until you die. And you can't drop out before then. If you want to be a child of God, if you want to be part of his kingdom, it's an automatic, lifelong training school that you're enrolled in. And if you try to drop out, the course gets very difficult at that point. So it pays to stay in and be claiming the child of God. Now, some of you are wondering possibly why someone wouldn't warn us about this school when you were choosing the faith. You were told that a while ago, maybe at some point, that if you trust Christ Jesus as your Savior, life will go a lot easier on you. I mean, things would happen. You'll have all the answers to all your problems when they come along. Your faith will see you through. And so you had this confidence about you, and that victory will be there no matter what. If you live on this higher plane where problems just kind of roll off you or glance off of you because you are a child of God, well, that's not real. And we know that, those of us who've been around a while. That sounds good, but it's not biblical. The Bible clearly teaches that God uses trials to train us to become more like Jesus, who learned obedience through the things he suffered. And this process takes time and it is painful. Just like my parachute jumping. We ran, we did all kind of stuff physically to prepare us in our way, and also our minds as well, to take that parachute jump. But the final product is worth it, as it says in Hebrews. You know, there's more to life than training, but training is what puts more into your life. The value of hardship and challenges, and yes, even stress. I remember this story. It was called Gatorade, Gatar-AID. It was given to the enlisted men in Florida training camp during World War II. Now, the daily routine for these GIs included a run through an obstacle course. On the final stretch of this endurance test, they had to grab hold of a rope and swing across this broad, shallow pool of water. Well, under that blazing hot Florida southern sun, the water looked so inviting. And pretty soon, they proved too great a temptation, so the men, hot and sweaty, most of them developed a curious habit of making it only halfway across the pond and then dropping. Until a lieutenant observed that and made a new home of a large alligator in that pond. From that day on, the recruits left the ground 15 feet above the water's edge and fell sprawling on the dust well over the other side of the pond. They were given Gatorade. Today's challenges and frustrations will be the alligators, encouraging us to go beyond the limitations we thought we have. It is through God's training that we're developing strength, endurance, humility, and confidence for tomorrow's challenges. If we didn't have those alligators, we would soon succumb to feelings of self-sufficiency and overconfidence, that we got it made, that we know all the answers, we've got it down. And it's so easy for us as Christians to say, okay, God, I got it down. I'll take it from here. God develops power in our lives through the pressure of hard times. Now, you may not be aware of the course of instruction or the objectives of the training. You're not familiar with the catalog of training. So you don't understand why certain things are happening to you right now, possibly in your life. It could be physical, it could be mental, it could be spiritual obstacles, it could be financial obstacles, whatever. And you're wondering why you're going through a certain test and why you will never seem to graduate from these tests. It seems like they go on and back to back. And sometimes you think that you passed the test, but then the next thing you know, you're going through the same course all over again. You solve this problem of finances, and here comes another one the next week. And you think, I just passed that test. I just had the faith in God, and I still have another problem come my way. I had another in-law problem, a child problem, a physical problem, and here comes another one to challenge me as well. It's easier to endure the program if you know what to expect. So I like to explain in this lesson from the life of David, King David, the program, the courses, and the objectives of God's training school that we're in and that he was in can show us what it's going to be like. We're going to cover chapters 18 through 26 of 1 Samuel to see how God trained David to become the powerful leader as king and icon of faith for us to learn from. I won't read those chapters to you. There's a lot of scripture there. But I want you to recommend to you that you take the time out to read those on your own and read that wonderful passages, 18 to 26 of 1 Samuel. Well, we've already seen this already in the story, but David was a very unusually gifted and talented young man. While he was still a teenager, he had been anointed as the king already to replace King Saul. And then he killed Goliath while he was a teenager. That victory pushed David into instant national hero status and most popular boy in town. He brought into the palace and set over the men of war, it says in 1 Samuel. Now imagine that. A teenage boy, not even 20 years old, and he was in charge of the men of war. Wow, that's unbelievable, the pressure on him. And yet God did not see fit to remove the corrupt Saul and install the upright David as king until David was 30 years old. What was happening, then I wondered, during those 10 or 12 years between David's victory over Goliath and his ascension to the throne? What was going on? He was in God's training school because he was not prepared to be king and to be a leader and to set history as he did. I read a quote recently from Julius Caesar, the great Roman emperor and also great military hero, that really makes sense. He said this: without training, they lacked knowledge. Without knowledge, they lacked confidence. And without confidence, they lacked victory. So training is the very beginning of knowledge, of confidence, and then victory. And that's where David had to be in that moment. So let's look at the program in detail, okay? And you've already signed up for it, for courses and objectives of God's training school. So let's talk about the program itself, okay? And there are several features I want to bring up to you about this program. Number one is this: God's training program is not explained to the student in advance. I'm sorry, you cannot see it now. Note how the program began for David. God did not, as far as Scripture records us, and we know about it, sit down with David and say, such as, now listen, David, here's what we're going to happen to you, and you need some training, you need some maturity, and you need some understanding of what's going to happen about the life that you're about to live. So I'm going to allow Saul to try to kill you and to chase you all over the Judean desert for the next 10 years so that you'll learn to depend upon me. Wow. If God would have done that, I'm sure, it may not record it, but I'm sure David would have said, I'm going back to the flock because I don't want this kind of training. He did not know what was going to happen to him. It just started happening. What happened was David just says, I trust in you, God, and away the training went. And he welcomed to God's training program. And that's how God enrolls his students. If he told us in advance what he planned to take us through to conform us into the image of Christ, would make a mad dash for the exit door. So aren't you glad that God doesn't allow you to know the future in advance? He reveals the program a step at a time as you're able to handle it. The second part of the program is this: God's training program, it goes on for a lifetime. I already said this earlier. David was a very sharp young man and was used mightily of God as a teenager, but God did not see fit to entrust him with the responsibility of the kingdom until he was 30 years old. So Joseph back during the Egyptian exile time, spent his 20s in the dungeon of Egypt and was not elevated to number 2 spot in the land until he was 30 years old. John the Baptist, another example, was about 30 when he began his ministry. Even the Lord Jesus waited to about 30 when he encountered and began his public ministry. And then we have Saul, who became Paul later on. When he met Jesus on the Damascus Road, was 30 years old, about 30 years old, before he became a great apostle of God's kingdom and ministry. I remember as a young man, I wanted to learn the saxophone. And I saw it played by someone, and I just marveled at it. I said, I want to be like that. And so my parents went and rented a saxophone and signed me up for lessons at school to learn how to play the saxophone. Well, that only lasted a few weeks when I found out I got to practice every day. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't have the discipline yet. And then I saw people playing the piano. I always wanted to learn the piano. And so I said, I want to take some piano lessons. And I think I went through about 5 lessons before I finally just quit practicing because I want to go outside and play. I just wasn't ready yet. but yet at the same time, I knew what I wanted. I thought I wanted anyway at that time. It takes practice and discipline to get ourselves ready. And it's a lifetime moment to learn how to have the right skills in order to do it. The third feature of God's training program involves many courses that must be repeated even if we pass them one time. You may go through a course and say, I got it, like I mentioned earlier, but you're going to have to go through it again. In the schools of this world, a passing grade means that you move into the next course. But in God's school, quite often a course has to be repeated even if you pass it. As we've seen how God called David a man after his heart while he was still a teenager, he was not rebellious or disobedient. He was a strong personal faith in God. But yet God enrolled David in course after course where he put David in extreme difficulty so he had to trust in the Lord again and again. You can read that when you go through 1 Samuel. It was during this time that David penned Psalms 34:19, and he said, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. So in other words, God's training or discipline is not just for those who are wayward to bring them back into line. It's also for those who are faithful and obedient, to make them even more like Christ, to be more faithful. Thus, you can pass a course in God's school with flying colors only to find yourself enrolled over and over again in the same course because it takes practice, practice, practice in our lives to take on the image of Christ in our life. I read that a piano sits in a room gathering dust. It is full of music of the masters. But in order for such strains to flow from it, fingers must strike the keys, and they must be the trained fingers, representing endless hours of discipline and dedication. You do not have to practice. The piano requires it, nor demands it. If, however, you want to draw beautiful music from the piano, the discipline is required. You do not have to pay the price to grow and expand intellectually. The mind either requires it nor demands it. If, however, you want to experience the joy of discovery and the pleasure of plowing new and fertile soil and to see wonderful and exciting things, effort is required. Light won't automatically shine upon you, nor will truth silently seep into your head by means of a rocking chair osmosis. It's up to you, and it's your move. It's my move. If I want to have music come out of that piano, I've got to have discipline and play it. If I don't understand things intellectually and from my heart, I have to go out and risk understanding and seeking that knowledge. The last part of this program is that God's training program is necessary for a person to be able to handle prosperity. Now, we've seen David was catapulted into fame and popularity as a result of his victory over Goliath. Often, that is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a young person. The Scottish historian Carlyle said this, affliction is bad, but every person that can handle prosperity, there are 100 that can handle adversity. Prosperity is the hardest thing to handle. God often uses adversity to humble a person so they can handle success. That might be why sometimes I wonder why God doesn't let me win the lottery, because he knows that much prosperity is dangerous to me, though I'd like to see if it would be or not. Well, anyway, we've covered them all about the program. But let's glance at a few other things about the courses. What kind of courses are inside the program that you and I are taking and will take again? Well, the first program course that we're going to take will be Broken Promises 101. And in this course, the student, which is you and I, will be promised something by someone, but that person will break that promise. The course will be repeated over and over again throughout our life. Now in 1 Samuel, to get Saul's second daughter, Michal, for a wife, and she must have been a real winner, I tell you what he had to go through, David had to do more than Saul had promised in order to get Michal as a wife. The second course is called Evil for Good 102. In this course, the student, you and I, will do something good for someone only to have that person do something evil back toward us. Now to pass, we have to not become bitter, and we have to repeat this over and over again throughout our life. And you can go back in your lifetime, and you'll see all this time this course has been going through your life over and over again, that you've been tested in this course, and it will happen again in the future. David had saved Saul's kingdom from being overrun by the Philistines by defeating Goliath. This course was repeated for extra credit in chapter 19, when David delivered the city from the Philistines, and they would have turned David over to Saul. This must have been David's favorite course, because he repeated it so many times in the story of these chapters. The next course I want to bring up is called Opportunity Testing 104. Now, in this wonderful course, we will be given an opportunity to take revenge on an enemy who has been attempting to ruin us and to hurt us. The student, that's us, will be tested for this response to this very enticing temptation. And this will be repeated over and over for extra credit. In 1 Samuel, David could have taken off Saul's head, but instead he cut off a small corner of his robe, and even that bothered his conscience. But David repeated this course again in chapter 26 later on, another time of opportunity for testing. That's only a sampling that I have mentioned here of these 3 or 4 courses God had used in his school. There's so many other ones. Paul lists his curriculum in several places in 2 Corinthians that you might want to look up sometime. So what is God trying to accomplish with his curriculum? Why does he require us, his servants, to go through such difficult barrage of courses over and over again throughout our lifetime? Well, let's answer that. Finally, let's look at the course objectives, which will answer that. Now, many things can be mentioned as the objectives, and I'll limit myself to 4 course objectives, which can be seen in what David was learning during his years of running from Saul. The first course objective was that David learned to take refuge in the Lord and to see the Lord's love even in adversity. I remember reading recently about a young student approached the Zen master and asked how he should prepare himself for his training. "Think of me as a bell," the master explained. "Give me a soft tap, and you will get a tiny ping. Strike me hard, and you'll receive a loud, resounding peal." So in a word, he learned to trust God even when it seemed like God did not care. He struck hard and received a loud, resounding peal of guidance and help from God, because he needed God. He demanded it from God. Do you see how that is changing him and is making him more trustworthy toward God? Now in Psalm 59, David wrote probably about this, about his escape from Saul, described in 1 Samuel 19. David's emphasis is on God as his refuge and strength, and on God's loving kindness. Now remember that David has just been forced to escape for his life from his own house when he wrote this. And here he is singing God's strength and love. What would it be like in singing circumstances in our life? Will we even be singing if we were just ran from our home and people were chasing us and we had to hide in caves up in the hills and the mountains of the Rockies or wherever we live? Never interpret God's love by your circumstances, but always interpret your circumstances by his love. But how do you do that? Well, let me illustrate that possibly. When a parent takes a child, a small child, to the doctor, the child is frightened and doesn't understand why. The nurse with the needle scares the child even more. And during this time, the child will hug close to the parent all the more, even though he doesn't understand why his parents brought him to the doctor to begin with. By way of contrast, if you ever tried and held a trapped bird, the frightened creature doesn't trust you, doesn't understand who you are. If it would just relax, you could help it and get it ready and it could fly away free. But it doesn't. It struggles inside of your grasp and wants to free itself and get away from you, which makes it even more difficult for you to help it. In times of suffering, we should be like the trusting child and not like the scared bird. Cling tightly to God and don't doubt his love. One of his objectives of his training school is to get you to take refuge in him and to see his love even adversity is around you. You cling to him, though you don't understand what is going on, because you know he is your refuge. The second part of the program is that, that David learned to seek the Lord's mind rather than act impulsively on his own. In other words, he learned submission. I mean, so many of us act first and think later. But David was learning to take the situation to the Lord before he doing anything else, and then to submit to the Lord's direction, what God wanted him to do. We already seen how David carefully sought the Lord's mind regarding the city of Keilah in the 23rd chapter. In the matter of Nabal, David flunked the course. He reacted in anger. He rode off to wipe out Nabal and his men before he stopped to ask God about it and what this is the right thing to do. And the Lord sent Abigail to stop David in his tracks from doing such a terrible thing. There's a story that I read recently about, and it's a really funny story. I thought it was hilarious because I've seen this in action in my own career, about some American soldiers who were training with the Swedish military. And these two soldiers decided to go to a chapel in a nearby town. They were not able to understand one word of Swedish, but they resolved to play it safe by sitting right close to a solid-looking man, citizen there, and would do exactly what that man did in the service. Well, in the course of the service, the local clergy paused to make some special announcement. They had no idea what he's talking about, whereupon the citizen leaped to his feet. Well, the two soldiers promptly did likewise, whereupon the entire congregation just went into gales of laughter, and the soldiers didn't even know why they were laughing so hard. Well, later on, the soldiers learned that the cause of the merriment. The Swedish clergy had announced a baptism and requested a father of the baby to rise. That had to be funny. So much for being impulsive. We have also seen in our lesson how on two occasions David could easily have killed Saul on the spot, but he obeyed the Lord. In later narratives, there are other examples of David very carefully pausing to seek the Lord's mind on a situation before proceeding, and then acting in obedience to the Lord as given by him by God of what to do and not to do. So the question goes back to us. How do we react in adversity? Do we push the panic button and try to eject yourself out of the situation by any means possible? Or do you stop and say, Lord, how do you want me to respond in this situation? What do you want me to do? And then do you do it when you know what the right answer is? Are you learning to submit to God in the courses in which he enrolls you? Martin Luther, one of our great Christian historian, person of our faith, said this: I have so much to do that I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer. What a great example for us all. I have so much to do. How much prayer do I spend in my day, at the beginning of my day or at the end of my day, seeking God's wisdom, seeking God's direction so I can obey and do the right thing? Well, here's the other objective that David learned was to wait upon the Lord for his timing. In a word, he learned endurance. So in 1 Samuel 26, David is said there that after this thing had been going on for years, he was running for his life and living in caves, while Saul lived in the luxury of his palace. So perhaps it was in this time that David wrote Psalms 62:5 when he said, "My soul wait in silence for God only, for my hope is from him." So David was learning to persevere, and God's timing was what he was seeking, and God was showing it to him. Anyone who serves the Lord must learn to wait upon the Lord and to endure. The Christian life is not a 100-yard dash, but it's a marathon of pacing ourselves through our whole lifetime, learning God's timing, learning God's ways, learning God's direction, so that we can win the race by the long haul, by the long run, the journey. The last thing that David learned was to acknowledge his sin quickly to the Lord and to those he had wronged. In a word, he developed a tender conscience. And I mentioned this earlier, at the beginning of our lesson. At one point during his running from Saul, David came to Ahimelech, the priest. And David lied by telling the priest that he was on a mission from Saul. So as a result of that lie, the priest helped David. Well, Saul heard about it and executed the priest and the whole village of priests where he lived. But one man, Abiathar, escaped and fled to David. Now put yourself in David's sandals just for a moment. By his lie, he caused the death of this young man's father and every person in his household, and in fact the whole village, because David lied. And then the man comes to you. What would you say? Would you duck your head and make excuses, or even put a lie on top of a lie? I mean, that'd be a temptation just to blame Saul for the whole thing. But David accepted the blame and confessed it openly to this man. As we've also seen, David's conscience was stricken after he cut off the edge of Saul's robe. And when Abigail confronted David about the wrongfulness of seeking revenge upon her husband, he immediately, before his men and before the woman, very humbling in that culture, by the way, acknowledged his sin and thanked the Lord for sending her and taking care of him. The difference between Saul and David was not that Saul sinned and David did not sin. The difference was that Saul, when Saul sinned, he would never confess his sin. He would just make excuses or ignore it or just be arrogant about it. But when David sinned and was confronted with it, he was quick to confess it to the Lord and to those he had wronged. One of the objectives of God's training school is that we learn to acknowledge our sin quickly to the Lord and to those we have wronged. He wants us to develop a tender conscience before him and to have a clear conscience by confessing our wrongness. Or as Paul testified, I do all best to maintain always a blameless conscience, both before God and before men. Acts 24:16. Well, let's conclude our lesson on God's training school. Those whom God must go through his training school to develop trust, submission, endurance, and tender conscience. That's the main things that we have to learn throughout our lifetime. And as a Christian, we are in the school. I hope that realizing that doesn't give you recurring bad dreams about training, but be reassured that God has your best interest at heart. Though it is difficult and not always fun, he is training you to share in his holiness within his kingdom. I want to share with you one closing story from my military past to illustrate what I'm talking about here. It will begin a hot August day in my training school at parachuting. And we ran everywhere. We ran in boots in our uniform that were always soaking wet from the sweat. And we ran here and ran there to keep our endurance up and to make us strong. Well, due to the attrition rate, I slowly became the executive officer, or the deputy, if you will, the second in command of the company, because everybody else failed. All the other officers failed. And I had one captain who was still the company commander, and I prayed for him every day not to fail so I wouldn't take his spot. So one day during training, it was called Ground Week, the hardest week there is. We had finished up the day and was running back to the barracks. And it was a long day of push-ups and doing everything physical all day long. And naturally, we were in the boots and uniform that were just soaking wet. And I was in the middle of formation as we were running, and we're heading uphill. At the top of the hill was where the barracks were that we were going to. And it's been a long day, and I was oh so tired. I began stumbling and getting slower as the instructors ran around us calling out jodies. And those were songs in cadence to us in rhythm, keep our rhythm going, and inspire us to keep running. Well, as the instructor was doing these jodies, he saw me struggling in the formation and ran up beside me to see if I was okay. I laboriously answered yes between my gasp of air. And I thought he was a real caring leader, checking on his troops, and he would let me slow down and catch up later and get my breath. But no. Instead, he began singing a jody with me as a subject. Chaplain, chaplain, can't you see this here run ain't killing me? Well, the rest of the company, of course, echoes this. And by that time, everyone's looking at me in the formation as we're running because I was the subject of the run. And then he kept on making more songs up. And now everyone's looking at me. Oh, just great. Now I can't stop. And I'm just thinking, how can I do this? And pretty soon he came up beside me as he was doing this. And then he put his arm on my shoulders as we were running. And I'm thinking, well, maybe he's going to try to help me, and lift me up to run. But no, he put his weight down on me on top of my own weight as we kept on running up this hill. I got so angry how unfair he was putting all that weight on me and torturing me further so I would fail. Well, the anger built up in me, and I had to decide. I either had to run, turn and hit him and get in big trouble, quit the run, or make the run even if it killed me. Well, I chose making a run. With gritted teeth and anger boiling in me, I forced every fiber of my body and mind to go forward. I was not going to let him embarrass me and stop me from succeeding. In fact, I wanted to lift him up and just carry him up the hill physically, just to show him I could do it. I was so angry. With my last strength, I made it. And the sweet words of slowing down to a walk sounded so great to me because I was exhausted. When we were dismissed, other soldiers came up to me and patted me on the back and knew I was struggling and congratulated me on being so great on making it. Then off to the side, the instructor stood there looking at me with a little knowing smile on his face and a nod of accomplishment, and then he turned and left. That was a moment in my life I have often remembered as a testing time of my perseverance, my faith, and the resources deep inside of me. Whenever I come against times when I'm severely tested, I remember that hot August day in training. And tomorrow, and tomorrow after that, and tomorrow after that will be another hot and sweaty run testing my spirit. It'll be called by other names, but it's still a run. I will be tested. I will feel the weight of responsibility. I will feel tired and discouraged. But I've made this run before, and I succeeded, and I will do it again. I have what it takes, because the Master is in the formation with me, and he is encouraging me. Someday, you and I, who succeed in graduating God's training school, will hear the voice of God saying at the ceremony, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into my glory. You have graduated." Here are some questions that I want you to think about in your life as for our close. Are small irritations and frustrations due to chance, or are they from the Lord using them to test us and to train us? And what scripture supports that answer? 1 Samuel. Read it. Is God's discipline only for the disobedient or for the obedient Christian as well. Next question. When all of our trials, David could have become bitter and depressed, but instead he was a man of praise. Why and how did he do that? And lastly, how can we know when to wait on God and when to move ahead in obedience on him? Think about those questions. And that might be the very beginning of learning another phase, another course of God's training school. Well, good to talk to students like myself in this school. We will graduate. We will make it because God is getting us to be like Christ, and that is worth it all because someday we will see God in glory. May God bless you. Hope this has been helpful to you. Read 1 Samuel, the 26th chapter, and on. God bless you.